We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Michael Lucci, the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute, illinoispolicy.org. And Michael, the big news, one of the big stories this week at the local level, Chicago Public Schools did actually manage to sell some bonds. They did it at usurious rates, having to guarantee an 8.5% yield in order to sell $725 million in bonds to keep the lights on for a few more weeks. This against the backdrop of the Chicago Teachers Union rejecting a deal that was advanced by the Chicago Public School System, that the Chicago Public School System had no idea how they were going to finance, but they were going to try and strike the deal anyway, a repeat of 4 years ago. And now you have the prospect of, you still have the prospect of CPS having to go through bankruptcy. You have the prospect of another teacher strike, although we spoke on the morning show this week with Jesse Sharkey from the Chicago Teachers Union, and he said they're still negotiating, so that 105-day clock is still ticking at this point. How do you see this playing out? Is there any way for this to play out other than through bankruptcy?
I think that this is one of the most shocking stories you see in the state of Illinois. You have a public school system that runs billion-dollar deficits every single year. They have no way to fund what they're currently doing. On the other side of them, you have a teachers union that's saying we're going to go on strike if you even make us pay for our own pensions at all, or if you don't give us the raises that we think we want. And meanwhile, the product of this system is failure. You have kids coming out of school who are not ready for college, by and large not ready for college, who can't do math, can't do reading, can't do the basic things that this system's supposed to provide. And then on the financial side of it, it is teetering towards bankruptcy. You mentioned that they sold their bonds at usurious rates. About 8.5% is the yield on some of those bonds. Detroit sold bonds with an 8.5% yield about 3 months before they entered bankruptcy. So this is, at 8.5%, if they're going to refinance all their debt at that rate, they're not going to be able to make the payments on just the interest on their debt, let alone being able to pay down all their long-term obligations.
Well, that number's so big, Detroit is actually buying CPS bonds. That's how bad that number is.
That's a good investment if you're in Detroit.
All right, for more on this, we're now joined by Kyle Olson, CEO of the Education Action Group. You can check out the stuff they do. Very good stuff in the area of K-12 education, eagnews.org. Kyle, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And so you've been tracking this story. Even your focus is national, but Chicago Public Schools, like the city of Chicago, has become sort of a national story in terms of what not to do. And what's some of the research you've done that helps to provide additional texture for CPS families, for Chicago and Illinois residents, and for CPS bondholders?
Sure. Yeah, we've been following what's been going on with CPS for years. The Karen Lewis and the strike, what was it, in 2012? This has been ongoing, and the school district has been having budget problems that have been going on for years. And it's interesting because they claim that they're cutting $100 million there, $50 million there, but their problems never really seem to go away. And so we recently submitted an open records request to the district and asking for salaries for employees. And what we found is that over 15,000 CPS employees make over $100,000 a year.
Now, does that include teachers and as well as administrative personnel?
Yes, teachers and administrators. And we're not going out and saying they're making too much per se. But what I think is important is for parents and taxpayers to look at what they're getting for their money, because when you contrast the results, and of course the way you do that is you look at academic achievement, it's not sustainable. And so when you've got, for example, 26% of CPS high school students are college ready, according to the ACT's subject matter tests. It's just not what parents and taxpayers are paying for is not living up to what they should expect.
Hi, Kyle. This is Michael Lucci, and I want to carry on with that point. the return on investment for the Chicago taxpayer here is just horrible. I mean, not only are we having these deficits every year, but the product that you're mentioning is not a good product. It's not a product that's going to attract businesses, manufacturers to the city of Chicago because we're not producing skilled people to fill jobs that they're going to want to have. And so on that point, what do you think of the politics of the situation where you have a wounded mayor who's not really strong to stand up to the teachers union here on the one hand. On the other hand, you have taxpayers who've been funding this broken system for a long time, getting very little in result from what they've put into the Chicago public school system. How do you think that balance of power works out? Do you think that the teachers union has an angle to push further than they would because we have a wounded mayor here who probably doesn't want another fight?
Oh, sure. I think so, because you look at back in 2012, when they did go on strike, I mean, I think the expectation was that Rahm was going to stand up to them and was going to, make them pay. But he basically rolled, and they got, essentially everything that they wanted. They still got a huge raise. They kept their pension payment that the district was paying. They kept a lot of what they wanted, and the debt and the deficit continued to mount. And so now, when he's got all the other problems that are going on, I can't believe that he's in a position to really basically stand up against them. Now, the other thing, though, I think is interesting is because I live in Michigan. And we, in Detroit, public schools have been controlled by the state for years. I mean, it's been well over a decade. And nothing has really gotten any better. And the budget hasn't really gotten any better. Academics have not really gotten any better. And so knowing what's gone on in Michigan, and now watching what is being talked about in Springfield, I just scratch my head and I think, why would Bruce Rauner want to take on that problem? There certainly is an issue with CPS. There's no question about that. But would state control actually improve anything? It might improve the financials because he could, decide what to do rather authoritatively. But from an academic perspective, I don't really see anything improving if that happens.
Well, there's two things. I think you make an excellent point because it's very much like the argument between Rahm Emanuel and Karen Lewis. It's not really much of an argument. It's two central planners arguing over who gets to be the central planner in charge. But the problem is central planning. And so this would be the same thing if you scaled it to the state level. But from Rauner's perspective and from the state's perspective, this is a little bit different than Michigan. Part of the problem is you can't escape CPS. It doesn't matter where you live in Illinois because CPS is mainly funded by state and federal tax dollars as opposed to local property tax dollars, which is the case in most school districts. So, you're living out in the suburbs and you think, oh, well, that's a Chicago problem. No, it isn't, because you're subsidizing Chicago's failures no matter where you live. And that brings perhaps more state scrutiny than you might otherwise suggest is useful. It seems to me that the answer to both of those problems, the one you raised as well as the one that's local Illinois, is change the way the money flows into the system to invest in families and let them choose their own destiny for their child the same way we do at the collegiate level.
Well, and that was the next point I was going to make was what they should be focusing on is how can they expand school choice and how can they create competition among schools? How can they put parents and students more at the center of the equation than Karen Lewis and her agenda? That's what they should be moving towards. Is diversifying the system, allowing the dollars that are being allocated to follow the child to the school that they best deem is in their best interest. That's what they should be focusing on. That's what every state and every mayor and every locale should be focusing on, as opposed to how can we prop up this government-run system so it's viable financially and academically.
Kyle, based on your experience in Detroit and with the public school system there, at what point do you think that public opinion stops being sympathetic to the union and actually turns on the union, especially in light of the massive property tax hike we just saw in Chicago? And as we just found out, a part of the negotiations that were going on between CPS and CTU here was another property tax, less than 1 year after our most recent property tax hike. Based on what you saw in Detroit, when does the public opinion start to turn on this whole idea of more taxes to throw into a failed system, while meanwhile the teachers of CTU are the best paid of any major school district in the country?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure when that happens. I think what parents get more frustrated about instead of at the union is just the whole bureaucracy and the whole system. I mean, for example, in Detroit, before the whole thing came crashing down, you had school board members that were being driven around in limousines. I mean, they actually had a driver service that were, shuttling these people around. I mean, that's how important they thought they were. And yet they were graduating kids literally who could not read. And they didn't apparently have a problem with that. And so that, I think, when parents look at the totality of the problem, which is the school board, the administration, the bureaucracy, the union, that's when they turn on it. Because, you think back to the strike, and I think one of the problems that Rahm had was that, according to the polling, Karen Lewis, for whatever reason, had huge support because parents believed her. They believed that, Karen Lewis is really out for the kids and not out for pensions and for sick days and time off and all of those sorts of things.
One of the other problems Rahm had is that he's a coward. It's a problem that persists. He is Kyle Olson, CEO of the Education Action Group, eagnews.org. Very good stuff on K-12 education all the time. Kyle Olson, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.